this video I'm going to talk about another wave pattern, and I found this cool app to help demonstrate what I talk about. So basically, a lot of what you see for surface patterns for waves, it comes out of several little points of disturbance in the water, either because the wind hits the water or something strikes the water, or fish. And these spread out. And as this app lovely illustrates, they start to interact with each other, and you end up with a chaotic pattern. Well, I'm not going to bother with the landscape for this, but first you need your lake. Somewhere high in the mountains of Wallachia, perhaps. I'll have to get to my Dracula stuff soon. So right away we can assume that a lot of the wave action might just be mirroring off of the walls of the lake, the shores. I'm going to sharpen my pencil. And that's a good place to start in thinking about how to plot out the shape of the water. Now, you'll notice sort of the shape I drew. I was thinking about drawing on a surface at an angle to myself. That gets a lot easier as you do more and more study of perspective, but also just observational study of, say, photographs and viewing, and also being very conscious of seeing. You'll get better at seeing the world through forms. So we're mirroring the shapes of the side of the lake, but then also thinking about letting them overlap, because that's what they would do, as we saw in the app animation. So I want to make sure that I keep my okay. And I want to draw the innermost part of the circle. I don't want it to seem too much like a target, but I'm thinking about areas of disturbance, possibly wind coming in to the lake and pushing the water. So one of the things that wind does you'll see if you watch a lake on a windy day, you'll see quick, fleeting, almost like flocks of waves sometimes. It's easier to see when the waves are smaller generally, and you can see the wind hitting the water. But when you do, you definitely see when it happens, the kinds of waves it gives off. I don't want to get so busy I can't see anything, but I do want to fill up the entire lake, and eventually, of course, the waves from one side reach the other side, so you always have that interference pattern. You want to continue out right across the lake. Say, oh Max, I thought you were going to show us a trick of how to draw waves in a lake. And yeah, I am. I'm showing you how to draw waves on a lake. You can simplify this, of course, but I'm going to go for a fairly detailed surface. Let's see. Still got some ink in this. Worked well. So I'm not going to bother going with the orange yet, but I will take a shot of this to throw up on the screen so you guys have a clean view of it. That'll work. So, I think what we'll do is use wash for this. So I have this nice small wash brush. So, at the shore, well, I guess before I start, I'm going to ink in the shore. That seems like a smart idea. I'll try, I quite like this new felt tip I'm using. Kuretaka Extra Fine. I mentioned having some of my drawing informed by reading about and thinking about how fractals work, and definitely in terms of like feeling a line. Part of it comes from sketching things, actually looking at and visual research. But then drawing it quickly on the fly usually comes from an intuitive feeling about the gesture and the shape of the line, and that irregularity in my head. I'm like thinking about tracing the sort of irregularity I see on rocks, and those forms translate well. That's the thing with fractals, is in fine detail or large scale you see the same patterns repeating, so they're good thing to think about a little. So again, the goal isn't going to be to try to copy perfectly what I mapped out with the blue. I don't want to get slavish. I need the fairly quick line. Now I would recommend actually having reference out, even as this, potentially if you've drawn a lot of water already. I'm not actually going to pull any out, not to show off, I just didn't think of doing it, but I did really obsess over this a lot when I was younger and spent a lot of time looking at photos of water. I still pull out reference of it sometimes, just to jog the memory, and sometimes I won't even bother with the penciling if I have some reference to glance at and kind of riffed off of freehand. I think what would be nice actually is to start with a lighter pencil. This is quite dark, so I might actually do that. Shift. Really better. So now I find I can do a lot of similar things I do with the brush, with the side of pencil. And it's the same technique basically. You're pressing harder to get tone out of the pencil, but you're still working your the z-axis, right? You know, so the z-axis and the y, but z-axis for thinking about controlling your drawing tool, be it a brush or a pencil, but particularly for a brush, it's critical to use one well. Leave the coast area lighter at first, I find. It's a good way to help highlight it. And if you do tone, it'd be good to reflect the perception of more detail there by doing a slightly more fine pattern when you get there. So I'm using the interference pattern between the different arcs to inform where I lay in little sort of cell shadows. So these would be the lower parts of the choppy water, sort of like what we saw, same pattern basically in a lot of ways as the close shot that we just did, but this could be the same sort of body of water at a distance. And I'm knocking it back so that it's not quite so contrasty. I'm not worrying about reflections because it is about the wave patterns I'm talking about here. You could go for the challenge of drawing a landscape and then try to figure out how it would look reflected. It's not strictly a mirror, it is, but your angle's quite oblique. That does some funky things with your intuitive sense about how things look at a distance. I find these little cell patterns lend themselves to a lot of tension in the hand, so good to stretch. Remember to keep things limber. Water is not tense as a rule, so you want to watch too much tension getting into your hand. Better to have kind of some sloppiness, and remember that you can essentially kind of hatch the interference patterns. So you notice this water's going behind the edge here, and this is the bottom, so we lose our white edge. That's just meant to be a way of making the shore stand out, potentially. You may end up filling it too, as you develop the finish for this in a given drawing. Learning a little bit about fluid dynamics kind of helps. I'm imagining that there is flow this way. The water comes in and swirls as it hits the eddy here, which is why you end up with this cut, and around and pools and goes out. So a lot of my patterns were thinking about the water moving around and through. Fluid dynamics, that's one way to draw. Well, learning how to see the world is invaluable if you really want to learn how to draw the world. You can draw really, make-believe stuff, and that's cool. I like doing it too. More simplified versions of a lot of these patterns are exactly what does that well. But I'm showing a finer resolution to show how it's basically just the building up of simple forms. So now we're doing feathering. This is one of the pattern exercises I get my students to do, and little batches. So it's suggesting waves coming away from the shore, but then the batches are also helping suggesting the ripples going this way. Again, at no time am I perfectly trying to copy the plan. I'm kind of figuring out it as I go. You're building the thing. That spontaneous energy is part of what makes it more dynamic and water-like. Arcing patterns around that little bit of shore jutting out. Reverse the curve for areas where the water's reflecting off, particularly where there's a bit of a divot. And consolidating some of the patterns. Looking for a lot of sort of general, and I'm thinking about the general, all the water getting compressed as it flows in. And I'll get more disturbed in this corner because it's got all these shores to bounce off of. You see how learning to feather with your brush is very, very useful. The diversity of feathering strokes is pretty broad, just based on, again, frequency, how short the feathering motion is. So, in case has been mentioned, feathering is basically, I'm exaggerating, you're coming down and up. So instead of drawing like that, that's the mechanics. But vary the size and length. And I want a feather in the direction of the surface frequently to describe the surface. There are some variations on that, but typically I get the best results that way. Okay. I got overworked. I think you get the idea. So you kind of think about the rippling edges and you map those out in light patterns, and then just use pencil or tone, or you could do it in ink, spot in ink, kind of like I did the last one, or you can do it in tones like this. I kind of like this better. Feels like a lake, no? I could draw a whole landscape perhaps. Maybe I will for the next video.